So some wonderful horror movies have been nominated at the Oscars, like Psycho and Carrie, and some have even won a few trophies like The Exorcist and The Silence of the Lambs. But what are some classic horror films that didn't receive a single Oscar nomination that absolutely should have? Hi, it's Brian. Welcome to the awards contender, and with Halloween just hours away, I thought it was appropriate to make a video about some of my favorite horror movies of all time that, for some reason or another, did not get a single Oscar nomination. Now, these are classic genre movies. I decided to not do everything every year. We're stopping at 1999. So any horror film that came out at the beginning of the film medium and the Academy Awards leading all the way up to the 1990s qualify for this video. Let's start with number 10, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Alright, so right off the top, you might think I'm crazy. Like, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre at the Oscars? Hell yes, I say. Of course, it was never going to get into like Best Picture, Best Director, the acting categories. But on a technical level, I do think the Texas Chainsaw Massacre deserved more awards recognition. This 1974 masterpiece, celebrating its 50th birthday, I do think is one of the best horror films of the 1970s. Every time I watch it, I get something new out of it. It plays almost like a documentary at times. It's like you're watching reality. It's so tense, so well paced, and what I'm always struck by when I watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is how little blood there is in that movie. Growing up, I would hear that title, and without even having seen the film, I assumed it was just a total gross out narrative. Something that would be extremely bloody, and that's not the case with this movie. I think it's very masterfully crafted, it's really well acted and shot and directed. I adore this film, and I think if it could have gotten one Oscar nomination, it would have been Best Cinematography. The cinematography in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I think, is outstanding. I don't care what kind of a movie it is. I mean, talk about setting a mood for that story. It's so well done, that would have been an all-timer Oscar nomination. Number 9, Dawn of the Dead.
Unemotional. Quiet. We've got to remain rational, logical.
George Romero's ultimate zombie masterpiece has never gotten old, has never shown its age. It's still just as relevant today as it was back in 1978. This is such a groundbreaking movie that takes a lot of the ideas that he put into Night of the Living Dead from 1968, which is also a great film, and he just takes things all the way to an 11 out of 10. It's like he's not messing around in this movie. He's not like, oh, I'll do a follow-up to that indie black and white film I made in the 60s. I'll just do more of the same. No. Like, George Romero is a bold, courageous filmmaker, and he went out of his way to make something truly unique in Dawn of the Dead. I know it came out like unrated and it didn't have like a big like theatrical run, so I don't know how many people back in 78 were taking Dawn of the Dead seriously as like an awards contender. I know it's like a zombie film. There are some really disgusting scenes, especially in the third act. So like, I mean, it makes sense to me. Most of the movies I'm talking about in this video, it makes sense why it didn't get in at the Oscars. But like, Roger Ebert gave this movie 4 stars. Many critics saw the value in Dawn of the Dead, and they didn't have a makeup category yet at the end of the 70s. I do think it would have been deserving of makeup. So I would say Best Director for George Romero, And best adapted screenplay, I guess it would be adapted since it's a sequel. And I would also throw in film editing too. I think this movie is masterful. It should have gotten in somewhere at the Oscars. Number 8, Wes Craven's New Nightmare.
I don't like that thing.
That thing puts bread on our table.
Is it alive, Daddy?
Heather!
So here's a film that I do think was ahead of its time. 2 years before Scream, Wes Craven makes one more Nightmare on Elm Street movie, and instead of just doing another sequel, this was the 7th installment, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, he did something very unique and original with this narrative and explore like what happens to the cast and crew of a franchise when the killer in that franchise is finally put to rest. What happens to that evil entity? Well, it starts attacking the real people who made the movies, like Wes Craven, like Heather Langenkamp. And I feel like if Wes Craven's New Nightmare had come along in like 98, 99, it would have done much better at the box office. There would have been more of a celebration of that movie. But in 94, audiences, I guess, just didn't know what to make of that movie, and it crashed and burned at the box office. It basically like put an end to the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, even though there's been a couple titles since. I think Wes Craven's New Nightmare is extraordinary. It is one of the most interesting horror films ever made. And if you're a fan of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, like it's essential viewing. Like it's so fascinating to see what Craven did with this film. I love so much about it. The performances, the scare scenes, the surprises. Ultimately, I do think the best thing about Wes Craven's New Nightmare is Craven's very original screenplay. So I think at the Oscars that year, the one and only Wes Craven deserved an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Screenplay. Number 7, John Carpenter's The Thing.
Anyone messes with me and the whole camp goes. Come on, child, burn me.
It is wild when you think about it today that John Carpenter's The Thing received 0 Oscar nominations. Like in all the technical categories, the Academy saw nothing to recognize that movie for. And like, if you didn't know, like John Carpenter's The Thing is such a revered movie these days, but it wasn't revered back in 1982. It came out right after E.T. And E.T. was the science fiction film like about aliens that people really wanted to watch. That summer, they wanted nothing to do with John Carpenter's remake of The Thing. And I mean, it's a very disturbing film. There are at least 3 or 4 scenes in The Thing every time I watch it that make me physically ill. Like, you know, I mean, it has a visceral reaction on the audience. And I think in 82, people just wanted nothing to do with it. But over time, over years and decades, people have finally recognized just how great of a film John Carpenter's The Thing is. There's so much to love about it, that story, those performances, those terrifying moments, like sprinkled all throughout the narrative. But I do think, even though the movie bombed at the box office, like how did John Carpenter's The Thing not get an Oscar nomination for Best Makeup? That is insane to me, because they had just introduced the makeup category the year before. The first winner was Rick Baker for An American Werewolf in London. So they showed they would recognize a genre film, like actually have it win. So it's like, why couldn't The Thing at least get a nomination? I think it's deserving of Best Cinematography, Best Sound, to be sure, and especially, Best Makeup. Number 6, a tie between Dracula and Frankenstein.
I never drink. Why?
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
So I don't typically do ties in my top 10 list, but I wanted to include both Dracula and Frankenstein, and like there was only room for one, so I was like, you know what? They both came out in 1931. They're both Universal monster movies, and they both were ignored by the Academy. So let's just put them both in number 6, starting with Dracula, which is just one of the most influential vampire movies ever made. Bela Lugosi, as that title character, is exquisite. And like, he was never going to get an Oscar nomination for Best Actor. This was in the early days of the Academy Awards. It got started at the end of the 1920s. So they were just starting to recognize movies, the Academy. Now, they did give Frederick March an Oscar win in Best Actor for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a year after Dracula and Frankenstein. The Academy proved that they were open to a performance from a genre movie getting in at the Oscars. It wasn't impossible, but yeah, Dracula wasn't going to get in there. But why not like cinematography? Why not in the sound categories? They could have given it a technical nomination in something. Same thing with Frankenstein, which came out later the same year, 1931. Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster, just like one of the most important, memorable screen performances in the history of the horror genre. Now, they didn't have Best Supporting Actor yet in 1931, so if he had been nominated, it would have been in Best Actor. He doesn't really say anything, so that would have been unusual, to say the least. But again, in technical categories, why not give Frankenstein a nomination in cinematography or editing or sound or something? Bride of Frankenstein, 4 years later, got a lone Oscar nomination in sound. So like, they were open to that. Why didn't they give any nominations to Frankenstein or Dracula for that matter? It's baffling to me to this day. Number 5, Scream.
Hello?
Hello?
Yes?
Who is this?
Who are you trying to reach?
So this is one of my favorite movies ever. It lingers just outside my top 10. It's probably like 12, 13, somewhere in there. I watch Scream almost once a year, I'd say. I love everything about that movie. I saw it at just the right age. I had just turned 12 years old, and I went to the theater knowing almost nothing, just that Wes Craven had directed it. And to go into Scream totally cold, knowing nothing, was a very exciting experience. That movie never gets old, even though, of course, we know who the killers are after the first viewing. Like, it's just so funny, it's so scary, it's so well written, the characters just pop, the actors are fantastic, the pacing of Scream is perfection. And like, as is the case with many of the other titles I'm talking about in this video, Scream is a slasher movie. And like, the Academy, they will go for horror films here and there, but when there's like a psycho killer, a slasher on the loose, typically they ignore those kinds of movies. I understand why Scream was not taken seriously by the Academy. Even though it was a huge monster hit at the box office, the reviews were pretty good. I would say if that film could have gotten 2 Oscar nominations, it would have been Best Original Screenplay for Kevin Williamson. I feel like that wasn't outside the realm of possibility. Like, if there had been just enough passion for Scream, if enough people had given that screenplay some critics' prizes, maybe it could have been in the mix, because it is so original. It's one of the best screenplays of 1996, I would say easily. And then Best Supporting Actress, Drew Barrymore. I think her performance at the beginning of that movie is a landmark in the history of the genre. And I mean, even back then, it was pretty startling to realize, oh my God, they're killing off Drew Barrymore. And part of me's like, if Janet Leigh can get an Oscar nomination in Best Supporting Actress for Psycho, why not Drew Barrymore for Scream? Number 4, The Innocence. This movie is so damn creepy and eerie and effective. The Innocence from 1961 starring Deborah Kerr. If you are a horror fan and have never seen The Innocence, go check it out immediately. You will not be disappointed. I went decades without ever having seen it until someone said, if you like ghost stories, like, it's pretty well done. It's really good. And I remember I put it on late at nights, one night around Halloween a few years ago, and I could not look away from the screen. It has some truly terrifying moments. And this is a film made way back at the beginning of the 1960s. And for a film made way back then to have that effect on me now, someone who has watched hundreds, thousands, really, of scary movies, I think that says something. It's so beautifully crafted on a technical level. The cinematography, the editing, the sound work, the performances are spectacular. Deborah Kerr, I mean, this woman got 6 Oscar nominations in her long career. She never won. I feel like that should have been 7 nominations. Deborah Kerr should have received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress in The Innocence. Absolutely. And if there was one other category I cannot believe it didn't get into, was Best Cinematography, Black and White. I think by the early 60s, they had 2 categories in cinematography, one for color, one for black and whites. Like, did anybody watch The Innocence? Are you freaking kidding me? How in the hell did The Innocence not get an Oscar nomination in cinematography? That is wild. Number 3, A Nightmare on Elm Street.
This is just a dream. This isn't real. This is just a dream. He isn't real. He isn't real.
So can you tell I'm a Wes Craven fan? I've got 3 Wes Craven movies to talk about in this video. This is the final one. A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984 is one of my favorite films of all time. Definitely in my top 10 favorite horror films ever. And again, it's a slasher film. It's very bloody. It's supernatural. These are all things the Academy pushes against, right? Like, the Academy says, no thanks, we're good. A Nightmare on Elm Street was never going to be a big awards player. Duh. But, like, it's so effective at what it sets out to do. I feel like this was a movie in 1984 nobody was expecting very much from, but wow, like, this frickin' movie, it is just unlike anything ever made. It is so scary, so bonkers scary, with that musical score, with that makeup of Freddy Krueger, that Robert Englund performance. He was never as terrifying as Freddy Krueger as he was in the first film. Like, you don't see Robert Englund at all in that movie. It has one of the best final girls ever in the history of horror in Nancy, played by Heather Langenkamp. And I just adore that movie, flaws and all. It's not perfect, but boy, is it effective. And I do think the Academy could have recognized A Nightmare on Elm Street in one category, Best Makeup. The movie is so creative and ingenious when it comes to makeup, when it comes to taking a very low budget and making it look like a multi-million-dollar movie. I would give this one Oscar nominations in Best Picture, Best Director, Best Original Screenplay, Cinematography, Editing, on and on and on, you name it. But, like, realistically, the Academy could have given it something. They could have given it Best Makeup. Number 2, The Shining.
It was almost as though I knew what was going to be around every corner.
Now, this egregious Oscar snub for the ages pissed me off so much I made an entire video about it. Why The Shining flopped at the Oscars, and like, it's not a super big mystery. The film opened in May of 1980. It didn't do very well with critics or at the box office. It was looked at by many as a step down for Stanley Kubrick. Many people thought Jack Nicholson was too over the top. Some people really hated Shelley Duvall. So, like, it makes sense at the end of the day why The Shining was snubbed at the Oscars. I still think it's ridiculous that it got 2 Razzie Award nominations. Like, come on. I feel like along with John Carpenter's The Thing, which came out around the same time, The Shining just didn't get the appreciation it deserved back then, but boy, does it have that appreciation now. I feel like most people making their list of their 10 favorite scary movies, The Shining is going to be on most of them. Like, this movie never ages. Every time I watch it, I get something new out of it. I adore the performances. I adore the slow nature of the storytelling. It's a movie that wraps you up for 2.5 hours and doesn't let go. And it's so beautifully made by Stanley Kubrick. It's like an art film done on a grand scale in the horror genre, and you can go back to The Shining over and over again and never get sick of it. That is the mark of a true genre movie classic. The Shining is just an all-timer. It should have gotten into the Oscars somewhere. Like in a technical category maybe, best cinematography. I think the late great Shelley Duvall is fantastic in that film. If she had been nominated in Best Actress, I would not be complaining about it. Same thing with Jack Nicholson in Best Actor. But if I could only go back and give The Shining one Oscar nomination, it would probably be Best Director for Stanley Kubrick. I think if he can be nominated in Director for Dr. Strangelove and 2001 and A Clockwork Orange and Barry Lyndon, he should also have an Oscar nomination in Best Director for The Shining. And now finally, that takes me to my number one choice. What do I think is the ultimate classic horror film that didn't get a single Oscar nomination, but I think absolutely should have? It's my favorite scary movie of all time, John Carpenter's Halloween. Halloween is more than a movie to me. Like, John Carpenter's 1978 masterpiece has played such a pivotal role in my life. It goes beyond just like an entertaining 90-minute slasher film. The tone, the mood of Halloween has like seeped into my bones. It is a part of me in a way very few movies are. And so, yes, I have a very specific connection to Halloween. Like, this is one of the most nostalgic kicks I get out of watching any movie ever made. As soon as I start 1978's Halloween, I am transported back to when I was a kid and when I first watched that film late at night and got so freaking terrified, I turned it off and I finished watching the movie the following morning. Like, that has not happened to me very much in my life, watching scary movies, but it happened with Halloween. And at the time when the movie came out, it was very popular. It wasn't a hit right away. It kind of built over a few weeks and months, but it really did well at the end of the day at the box office, and critics really loved it. Roger Ebert gave it 4 stars. Many critics at the time recognized this was a truly great film in the horror genre. I don't know if because the movie needed a little bit to catch on, if maybe it took until early 1979 when like a lot of the critics were embracing it, I don't know. But every time I go back and watch Halloween, first off, I have a great time every time I watch it. Like, I sit back and I enjoy the experience still to this day of watching John Carpenter's Halloween for like the 87th time. I don't know how many times I've watched it. But I also think to myself, you know, this film had a very tiny budget. John Carpenter and company had little at their disposal. And what they were able to put on the screen, what they were able to do with this very simple story, a very kind of fresh cast, including Jamie Lee Curtis in her feature film debut. Only Donald Pleasance really had a bunch of important film credits behind him. The acting by everybody in Halloween is solid. It's not awards worthy. I'm not going to sit here and say Jamie Lee Curtis deserved a Best Actress Oscar nomination for Halloween. I wouldn't go that far. But I would say John Carpenter in Best Director. Like, his name should have been floated. Like, I think his work on this movie is that good. But if there were two categories, I do think the Academy should have taken John Carpenter's Halloween seriously. It's Best Cinematography and Best Original Score. I've talked about cinematography a lot in this video, and I do think the look of Halloween is exquisite. Like, there are certain shots in that movie that take your breath away, starting with that opening shot that goes through the entire Myers house, and we see a murder, and even though there are a couple hidden cuts there, it has the feeling of like the opening of Touch of Evil. It has a creative bent to it that really shows we are not just going to make a standard slasher film here. This is a movie that's going to be made with a lot of artistry. And so I think Dean Cundey, the great Dean Cundey, who shot Back to the Future and Jurassic Park, and who has only received one Oscar nomination in his long career for Who Framed Roger Rabbit, I would have loved to have seen him receive an Oscar nomination for John Carpenter's Halloween in Best Cinematography. That would have been awesome. And then what about Best Original Score? The Omen for Jerry Goldsmith won in this category 2 years before. I feel like if The Omen can win Best Original Score at the Oscars, why can't John Carpenter's Halloween at least get the nomination? It is so scary, so memorable, right from the opening credits all the way to the end. It is one of the best all-timer scores to a horror film. I do think John Carpenter, who never received an Oscar nomination in his long career, should have gotten in at the Academy Awards in Best Original Score for Halloween. That would have been so freaking awesome, so well deserved. For my personal favorite movie in the horror genre, John Carpenter's Halloween is 1 in a million. It should have been recognized at the Oscars.
What's the boogeyman?
As a matter of fact, it was.
Thanks so much for watching and subscribing, and let me know in the comments below what are some other scary movies you think should have received at least one Academy Award nomination, and we'll see you next time at the Awards Contender.